If you've ever found yourself stuck in an endless cycle of negative interactions with your partner or friends, then you may have heard that you're playing some kind of psychological game. This idea of psychological games is just one of many theories developed by Berne, a psychiatrist whose work continues to influence psychologists and self-help gurus alike. In this episode, we'll be talking about who Berne was and how his ideas became the building blocks for a lot of popular psychology you hear nowadays. Let's get into it. After graduating from medical school in 1936, Berne began working at a psychiatric clinic in Topeka, Kansas, where he would spend the next 6 years developing his skills as a psychiatrist. He published several papers during this period, but none of them dealt with the subject matter he'd become famous for. In fact, at the time, none of those ideas had even been invented yet. That wouldn't happen until later, after Berne moved to California in 1942 and began teaching at the San Francisco Psychoanalytic Institute. It was here that Berne met two men who would help him come up with the basic structure of what would eventually become known as transactional analysis. The first was Donald Jackson, who had recently moved to the Institute from London. There he'd been a member of a small group of analysts that had broken away from traditional Freudian psychoanalysis and sought to develop something new. They called themselves the London Group, and while there, they began discussing the possibility of creating a more direct route to mental health by analyzing the patterns of everyday interactions, instead of relying on the lengthy process of uncovering repressed childhood memories. This method quickly gained popularity, especially among the younger members of the Institute, and Berne was quickly drawn to it. The second person Berne met at the Institute was a patient named Harry, who taught Berne the principles of what Berne would later call radical acceptance. Harry was an African-American man who'd been brought to the Institute by his wife, who thought he should see a psychiatrist because he was depressed. But Harry refused to speak to anyone except his wife, so no one thought it would do any good. Berne, however, wasn't convinced. So he asked if he could meet with Harry alone. When his wife left the room, Berne asked Harry, "What brings you here?" To which Harry responded, "My wife says I'm crazy." Then he turned and looked out the window. Berne sat with him in silence for a few moments before asking, "Do you think you're crazy?" "Well," Harry said, turning back to him, "I don't know. I haven't had an opportunity to look at myself lately." This simple interaction stuck with Berne because of the way Harry answered his question. Instead of immediately jumping to conclusions, Harry showed Berne that he was able to step back and observe himself objectively. As Berne later wrote, "He was showing me that it was possible to accept and even welcome whatever might turn up in consciousness without trying to change it or running away from it." This idea of radical acceptance would go on to become one of the core tenets of transcendental analysis. And the third piece of the puzzle came when Berne traveled to New York City in 1952, visit another psychoanalyst named Ralph Geer, who had written a paper on a therapy technique that aimed to improve interpersonal relationships through examining the ways patients responded to social situations. Berne was inspired by this idea of focusing on current relationships to gain insight into unconscious processes. It was then that Berne began to sketch out the basic principles of what he would later call transactional analysis. So let's talk about the main ideas. First, we'll start with the parent-adult-child model. One of the most influential concepts from transactional analysis is the idea that each person has three distinct ego states. It's a parent, the adult, and the child. According to Berne, these ego states are like three different personalities all rolled into one. The parent ego state is the one that judges and criticizes our behavior. It's the voice inside your head that tells you you're being stupid or worthless. The child ego state, on the other hand, is the one that wants to play and have fun. It's impulsive and emotional and doesn't care about what anyone else thinks. The adult ego state, though, is the one that tries to balance the demands of reality with our own desires. It's the part of us that makes sure we pay our bills on time and show up for work. But sometimes these three ego states can get out of whack and cause problems. For example, maybe you're in an argument with your boss and your parent ego state starts to take over. you start yelling and judging them and their decisions. Then your child's ego state jumps in and tells you to just quit your job and do something else. Your adult ego state, though, knows that quitting your job isn't a realistic solution and tries to bring things back down to earth. If this sounds familiar, then you know that these three parts of our personality often clash and compete with each other. But according to Berne, when we understand how they interact, we can learn to control them better and use them to our advantage. For example, one of the ways we can learn to control our ego states is by becoming aware of the different kinds of transactions we have with other people. A transaction is basically an exchange of messages between people, but it's not always a straightforward exchange. Sometimes there are hidden meanings behind what people say or do. And according to Berne, these hidden meanings can cause all kinds of problems. Let's say, for example, you're in an argument with your friend. Your friend says something that upsets you, so you respond by saying, "You're really pushing me here." Your friend doesn't realize that they upset you, so they respond by saying, "I'm sorry, did I do something wrong?" Now you think about it, you didn't actually mean for them to apologize. What you wanted was for them to admit that they made a mistake. So you say, "No, it's okay. I guess I was just feeling a little sensitive." Your friend thinks everything's fine now, but secretly you're still angry. Why? Because your friend never acknowledged that they did anything wrong. According to Berne, this kind of hidden meaning is called a double bind. And it happens when someone says one thing but means something else. Double binds are one of the main ways that psychological games are played, and they can cause all kinds of confusion and frustration. Another type of transaction that can cause problems is called a manipulation. A manipulation is when someone tries to change your behavior by making you feel guilty. For example, let's say you're supposed to meet your friend for coffee, but you're running late. As you're walking into the cafe, you see your friend sitting there with an empty cup. You know that they just got their coffee, but you're hoping that they'll save you one. So you ask, "Can I get some coffee too?" Your friend looks up from their phone and says, "Why aren't you here yet? I was getting tired of waiting." Secretly, they were hoping that you would buy them another coffee, but instead, you both end up paying for 2 drinks. This kind of transaction doesn't make anyone feel good, and it can lead to resentment. According to Berne, the best way to avoid getting into these kinds of problematic transactions is to be aware of them and to take responsibility for your own behavior. We need to learn to make requests directly and assertively. If we want something, we should just say so instead of trying to manipulate the other person into giving it to us. Of course, this takes practice, but the more we do it, the better we become at it. And when we become good at it, we can avoid a lot of the games that people try to play on us. Another important concept from transactional analysis is the idea of strokes. A stroke is a unit of recognition, and it's something that all humans need in order to survive. We need to be touched and held by our caregivers when we're babies. And we need to be hugged and told that we're loved when we're children. As adults, we still need to be recognized and appreciated by the people around us. According to Berne, we all have a stroke bank where we keep track of all the strokes we've received. If our stroke bank is full, we feel good about ourselves. But if our stroke bank is empty, we feel bad. And one of the ways we can keep our stroke bank full is by giving strokes to others. Finally, let's talk about how Berne's ideas influenced later New Age psychology. As we mentioned earlier, one of the things that sets transactional analysis apart from other forms of psychoanalysis was its focus on the present moment rather than the distant past. This focus on the present made it easier for people to see how their past experiences were affecting them in the present. And it also made it easier for them to change their behavior, because they didn't have to wait until they'd uncovered all of their repressed memories. Instead, they could just start working on changing their behavior right away. This made transactional analysis very popular in the 1960s and 70s, a time when people were looking for new ways to improve their lives. And it was also at this time that Berne's ideas began to influence the emerging field of self-help. One of the most famous proponents of this kind of self-help psychology was John Sharp, who wrote a book called How to Get Your Man and Keep Him. In it, he applied the principles of transactional analysis to dating and relationships. He advised women to be assertive and direct when dealing with men, and he taught them how to avoid the common pitfalls that cause relationships to fail. While this kind of advice was controversial at the time, it went on to become very popular, and it paved the way for future generations of female empowerment coaches. Another way that Berne's ideas influenced the New Age psychology movement was through the concept of radical acceptance. This idea, which we discussed earlier, is based on the belief that we can choose to accept whatever is happening in our lives without trying to change it or escape from it. This idea was popularized by the psychologist John Welwood, who wrote a book called The Celestine Experience. In it, he argued that we can use difficult experiences as opportunities for growth if we're willing to accept them and learn from them. This kind of thinking is a big part of the New Age psychology movement, which emphasizes personal growth and the power of the individual. And finally, we'll mention that Berne's ideas also influence the field of family therapy. Family therapy is a type of psychotherapy that focuses on the relationships between family members and how those relationships affect each person's behavior. One of the founders of family therapy, Salvador Minuchin, used transactional analysis to help families identify unhealthy patterns of communication and behavior. He developed a therapy technique that he called structural family therapy, which involves changing the way family members interact with each other in order to create a healthier environment. All in all, Eric Berne's ideas had a profound impact on the field of psychology and continue to be influential today. His work helped pave the way for a more psychologically grounded approach to spiritual inquiry, which is something that we're seeing more and more of in modern culture. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Like and subscribe.